And good evening. Today we have a very important topic, and as medical professionals, we are very concerned with substance use disorder, and we know that the physicians who work in other specialties other than palliative care, they are very much concerned about substance use disorder with opioids. Uh, but we know that many patients would need opioids for treating pain, and sometimes even non-cancer diseases, patients also requires strong opioids for treating pain. Uh, but we also have the responsibility to make sure that it was used in a proper way. So there is a balance between the use and how to use and what to advise, etc. Today's topic is on opioid use disorder with special reference to the balance of prescribing opioids. We are fortunate to have a eminent faculty, Dr. Keith Humphreys, who is a psychologist, and presently he is the starting memorial professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Science at Stanford University. He is also a senior research career scientist at the VA Health Services Research Center in Palo Alto and an honorary professor of psychiatry at the Institute of Psychiatry, King's College London. His research addresses addictive disorders and translational science into public policy. Dr. Humphreys has been extensively involved in the formation of public policy, having testified to U.S. House and Senate committees and in many state legislatures, and having served on the White House Commission on the Drug-Free Communities during the Bush administration, and as a senior policy advisor in the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy under President Obama. He created and co-directs the Stanford Networks on Addiction Policy, which brings scientists and policymakers together to improve public policies regarding addictive substances. He also leads the Stanford National Commission on North American opioid crisis. Dr. Humphreys has also uh, testified on numerous occasions in the UK Parliament and advises multiple UK government agencies. He and authors of Drug Policy and the Public Good won the 2010 British Medical Association's Award for Public Health Book of the Year. And to recognize his services to addiction-related services and scholarship in Britain, Queen Elizabeth made him an honorary officer in the Order of British Empire in 2022. And he has extensively written on substance use disorders. And now I'm handing over to Dr. Keith Humphreys. And um, welcome, Dr. Keith, and it's all to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me to speak with you today. Let me see if I can get my slides going. Okay, can people see those?
Yes.
Yeah, terrific. Okay, so we have a fair amount of time together today, so I want you to please be free to interrupt me as I go and add your comments and questions, and I want to make this useful to you. So I'm going to talk, as was said, about the need for global balance and also tell you about a Lancet commission on the North American opioid crisis. So one of the things we say is very important about any work in this space is that there's a lot of people who have undeclared conflicts of interest. So I want everyone to know that the commission was funded by an unrestricted philanthropic grant, no connection to industry. We could just say whatever we wanted to say. I have never taken any money from the opioid manufacturers or distributors. Everyone volunteered their time very generously. Nothing in the report should be, and this talk today is based on the commission report, necessarily reflects the official views of Stanford, the VA, the Lancet, or any other organization. We are speaking as individuals. We set a rule among ourselves that we would have to agree 90% of us to recommend something, and it's on our heads, our responsibility, what we recommend. If you want to read the full disclosures of everybody who was involved, that is on the Lancet website. So who was on this commission? Well, it was a mix of people. Oops. Goodness, seem to have lost my slides. Let's try again here. Okay. All right. Hope you can see that. Not sure what happened there. So we had a mix of people. These issues that we delved into, addiction and pain, have many fields can contribute. So we had people who were professionals in addiction medicine, people who are expert in the biochemistry of opioids, people who work in emergency medicine and epidemiology, we had health economics experts, health equity experts, internal medicine, law, pain medicine, policy analysis, psychiatry, pharmacology, and public health. There's a lot of different viewpoints. Sometimes it was hard to get them all together, but we were able to do it in the end. In terms of the background, we had people who work with patients, people who are scientists, people who are teachers, people who work in public policy, and we also had people who had lived experience of addiction and of chronic pain. We worked together for over 18 months, and as I said, we would not make a recommendation unless 90% of us agreed to it. That was a pretty high bar, but we actually were able to agree on quite a bit, as you will see. Here are the people who were involved. I'm very grateful to all of them. Also grateful to, we had some outside advisors who gave us extra reviews and feedback, where they're acknowledged at the bottom. Grateful to them as well. Okay, let me start by telling you how are we doing in the US right now. Not very well. So we in the report, we highlight 3 waves to this. Wave 1 started in the late 1990s. And what that was driven by is an extraordinary increase in the prescribing of opioids. This, what's in this chart here is opioid overdose mortality. That was done, because of a legitimate concern about undertreated pain, which was a problem and still is a problem. And that was that humanitarian desire to treat that pain was driven by the companies that produce opioids to be just a sort of monomaniacal focus on just more prescribing, when in fact, as you all know, there's lots of things we can do for pain in addition to opioids. But that's how it was framed, and that's how it worked out in American healthcare system and also in the Canadian healthcare system. So as prescribing goes up and up and up, more and more people start getting addicted to these prescription pills, and more and more people start dying from them. And you can see that in the blue line is all opioids put together, and the other lines are different subtypes of opioids. That continues to around 2010. And at that point, there's a change in American drug markets. At this point, many people are addicted to pills from their doctor. Many people are addicted to pills that are being diverted from doctors. And into this environment comes a surge of heroin. Now, heroin had always existed in the United States in big cities. We had a heroin market in New York, in Philadelphia, in Los Angeles, Washington, D.C. But what was different this time was it really surged in smaller cities and towns that hadn't had as much of a heroin market. And a big reason for that was that people who sell heroin were able to convert people who were addicted to pills over to heroin, because heroin costs about a third as much. And when that happened, we began to see more people dying of heroin overdose. After about 4 or 5 years of that, things got even worse to where they are now, which is the rise of synthetic opioids, most notably fentanyl. Fentanyl is extraordinarily profitable to traffickers. It can be made in a lab. It doesn't require agricultural labor. It doesn't require thousands of miles of transport. So it's very cheap to produce. And traffickers produced it not because there was demand from customers, but because for them it's very profitable. Fentanyl, as you know, is a very, very strong opioid, very hard to dose accurately. As it entered the drug supply, we saw unprecedented deaths. So we're now losing in the United States a bit over 100,000 people a year to drug overdose, and probably 70% of those or so are due to fentanyl. Here's a mortality map of North America. You can see the United States and Canada being affected. Getting a little feedback there on the line. So if you're not speaking, if you could mute, that would appreciate it. This is, you can see where the darkest area happens to be where I'm from, which is called West Virginia state in the East United States, with incredible mortality, 72 per 100,000. But there's really no part of Canada and the United States that is untouched by this epidemic. If you want to know how bad is this relative to other problems, health problems that we've had, when I started my career, the biggest epidemic was HIV and AIDS. And it was at its peak year, which was about 1993, and not this high. You would have to go half as high again as the worst of the AIDS epidemic to get to these levels of mortality. So this is quite severe. If you want to compare it to COVID, we just did a study of Canada specifically, which showed that although more people lost their lives to COVID than to opioid overdoses during the pandemic, years of life lost, about 5 times as many were lost to opioid overdose, because the typical person dying is in fact pretty young. We've had real changes in the demographic makeup of who is being affected. Early on, 2 groups were affected were white Americans and people, indigenous populations or native populations. Originally, it was white rural people in sort of low-income regions in a region called Appalachia in the eastern mountains of the United States, and then out on the reserved lands for native peoples. It had that character for a long time, but as the epidemic has gone on and fentanyl has arrived, there's been a change such that now the fastest growing deaths are among Hispanic or Latino and Black Americans. And they have caught up, Black Americans have caught up to white Americans, unfortunately, now with very high overdose rates. Throughout all that time, again, the damage to Native communities has been just absolutely terrible, unfortunately. In our commission, we made a model, a predictive model, to guess how bad this could get if we don't take any action. And we showed that in North America, over 1 million people, we believe, will die of opioid overdose in this decade if we don't change our policies significantly. So this is pretty disastrous. And again, this is just overdose deaths. If you looked at years of life lost, this would be even more terrifying a statistic. All that said, we're fully aware that we need opioids because we also have a crisis in chronic pain. In fact, Sean Mackey, who's one of the authors of this very major report about the prevalence of pain in the United States, was on our commission. And it was important to, grateful to him for reminding us that this isn't a case where you just want to get rid of opioids, because we also need to take care of people with chronic pain. About 20% of adults have chronic pain in the United States. 8% have high impact chronic pain that causes severe distress and functional impairment for them. So we were trying in the commission to balance those things. If you would like to know where did this crisis come from, here is our analysis as a commission. So it was initiated in a time of legitimate concern about poor pain management in the 1990s. Many people in pain in the United States, very poorly treated, a kind of a stigmatized condition, a condition that doesn't get a lot of resources connected to it. And so that is a noble desire to relieve pain. And I should add, I work in addiction. I also worked in hospice care for a decade. I'm very aware of that personally and clinically, how important it is to have good pain management. And obviously opioids are a part of that. That, I would say, that legitimate concern got co-opted or taken over by companies that produce opioid manufacturers into a message that opioids was the only thing and that we should be prescribing more and more and more. And they convinced quite a few people of that, and to very ill effect. And one of the tragedies of the epidemic is, even though we quadrupled opioid prescribing, there was no evidence that we reduced pain in the process. It wasn't, though, just the case that we had bad corporate actors engaging in inappropriate behavior. It is also true that we failed. Everyone involved in regulation failed. Everyone who's supposed to keep the healthcare system safe. And in the report, which you can see online, it's free and available to anybody who wants to read it. Those were different kinds of failures. There were failures in regulations about licensing doctors, about licensing medications, failures in law, failures in healthcare policy and practice. We had a lot of corruption, and a lot of people didn't do what they should have done to protect the public. And the reason it's important to remember that is that there's no reason this couldn't happen again with different set of drugs. We could see all this happen again with benzodiazepine manufacturing. We've just approved esketamine as a medical drug. It could happen again with esketamine or future drugs that are approved. The illegal markets that we have now that are very big in heroin and increasingly fentanyl in the United States were stimulated by the legal market. This is sort of unusual. Normally, you think when something's legally available, the desire to sell it illegally drops. But in this case, it created so much demand because so many people were addicted to opioids, it actually grew an illegal market. So if the companies say sometimes, well, it's not our fault that anyone dies of heroin or fentanyl because we're not distributing that, that's not really true, because without what they did, those markets would not have come back. COVID was very bad in North America for people with substance use problems. It was sort of the perfect storm, so to speak. So you had both an increase in distress, depression, loneliness, bereavement, anxiety, fear, and taking away of a lot of support, structure, social connection, accountability. So on both sides of the equation, the things that may encourage people to use drugs and the things that help them not use drugs, COVID made those things worse. And we saw that in our overdose death rates. The typical city in the United States had about a 30% increase in overdose deaths during COVID. And in Canada, it was actually about 60%. We've never had increases like that in overdose rate in US history before. The commission addressed 7 different domains, and it would take many hours to go through all of them. So I'm just going to focus on 4 that I think will be relevant to your interests. And here they are. First, the opioid crisis of North America as a case study in multi-system regulatory failure. Then I'm going to talk about how you build systems of care for people with substance use disorders. And then about opioids' dual nature as both a benefit and a risk to health. And then last, the potential spread of the North American opioid crisis around the world, including to India. So let's start with the regulatory failure. It's kind of stunning to see how far out of international norms the United States got. Now, this is only rich countries, as you know, rich countries are, have the most opioids. We have 4 countries where we have, virtually none, which is terrible. But so even in that group of wealthier countries, if you look at this is the United Nations data on standard daily dosing per million inhabitants. The United States is extraordinarily high over there on your left in the slide. The only nation that comes close to the United States at all is Canada, and Canada too has an opioid overdose crisis. Some people look at this and say that must be that people in the United States are in so much pain that they need all those opioids. But we know that's not true, because if we go down to the middle of the chart, when we look at population pain surveys, France and Italy, or there in the middle, have about comparable population pain as the United States. And yet they prescribe about 1/6 or 1/8 of the opioids. So it really wasn't driven by our having greater pain. It was driven by other things. This is one of our key problems, which is the power of the corporations to promote and sell these drugs. So you can see in this chart, these are names you'll recognize of large pharmaceutical companies. This is 2013 data. The orange in each are these are all billions of dollars. The orange represents sales and marketing, how much they spend promoting drugs. And the light blue green kind of color is how much they spend on researching new drugs. So if you start at the biggest one, Johnson & Johnson, a name you all know, they spend $17.5 billion a year on sales and marketing, and about 8.2 on research and development, so twice as much in promotion. And you will notice across all companies, they spend a lot more money promoting drugs than they do developing them. Also important is that all these companies and many other companies are supposed to be regulated by the Food and Drug Administration, whose budget is smaller than the sales and marketing budget of the smallest of these companies. So you have outmatched regulators in terms of dollars we devote to them against a pretty potent corporate sector producing and promoting very aggressively a lot of drugs. We also have a problem in regulation, which we call the revolving door problem. And the best example I can give of that is that Purdue Pharma produced the drug OxyContin. And OxyContin became famous because of all the people who got addicted and died from it, but also because this very potent opioid had a label on it, which was later held to be criminally fraudulent, which said that OxyContin was believed to be less addictive than other drugs. This is a long, slow release, allegedly slow release, very powerful opioid. And it said it's believed to be less addictive. There was no evidence to support that. And you might wonder, how did the government ever approve such a fraudulent label on such a dangerous drug? Well, the responsible official in the US government who did that, 12 months afterwards, he was working for Purdue Pharma. And we call that the revolving door. They can be very lucrative for officials to make decisions that are congenial to corporations because they know later they can get jobs making much, much more money. And it's a very important part of corruption in the United States, and we saw a lot of it in this area. We also had corruption of what were packaged as patient grassroots groups. One of the famous ones, the American Pain Foundation, it was presented itself as the independent voice of pain patients, and it testified in hearings, and people talked about what pain they were in and how much they needed more and more opioids. And it turned out later it was funded almost entirely by the opioid manufacturers. It was not a grassroots group. It didn't represent patients. It represented those companies. And we have a number of groups like that, not just in the United States, around the world, but fake advocacy groups. And they can be very effective, but they are fraudulent because they are just creatures of the industry. This is a chart on how much money is spent in our state legislators. We have a federal government in the United States. We also have 50 individual state governments, and state governments oversee a good deal of medicine. And this is over a 10-year period. And this is how much money was spent by the pharmaceutical industry on things like lobbying, meaning, meeting with legislators, telling them, to vote for some bills and not others, and how much money was given to legislators for their political campaigns in favor of more opioid prescribing versus how much was given by groups trying to oppose opioid prescribing. And that teeny little orange section there of $4 million over that time is what was the opponents of the opioid industry spent, and the industry itself spent $880 million. So that's over 200 to 1 spending at the state level on influencing politicians to give decisions congenial to the industry. So again, it's no wonder, given that happened, that so much bad prescribing happened. This also happened at the federal level. These are both a really very good book, American Cartel, and then papers in this is a Washington Post newspaper broke a story about this on their outlet. You can see that online on their site. But one of the things they point out is the distributors, who are the people not who make the opioids, but who deliver them around the country, are supposed to let the government know if they see suspicious shipments. And they were shipping, in some cases, millions and millions of pills to towns that literally 1,000 people in them. Should have been very suspicious, but they didn't do their job. So the Drug Enforcement Administration, which is part of the government, cracked down on them and said they had broken the law. And what the industry managed to do was essentially hire a bunch of people, including a bunch of people who worked in the Drug Enforcement Administration, to work for them, switch sides, and advocate with their Congress. And they basically took away the power of the Drug Enforcement Administration to do anything about it when they overshipped opioids. So that's a pretty disturbing story. What can be done about it? So we recommend, first off, curtailing pharmaceutical product promotion. And all this money that is spent on things like visiting doctors and giving them gifts and taking them to conferences and and buying them meals and spending on advertising should be restricted, reduced. We talk about many ways that can be done, whether it's to reduce its tax advantage or simply to outlaw it, or whatever. But that needs to be restricted. Second, we suggest closing the revolving door between industry and regulators. People will not work for the public if they know that they can leave at any time and then go work for the industry they're supposed to regulate at a much higher salary. And so we talk about multiple ways to do that, including, by the way, paying people in government more if they're good at their jobs. Why not? They're going to work for the public. We could reward that. We also talk about ways to expose fraudulent, what are called into these fake patient advocacy groups. They're sometimes called astroturf groups. Astroturf is artificial grass some people have on their front lawn instead of grass. And so astroturf is used to refer to them because they act like they're grassroots, but they're not. But trying to restrict those, not let companies buy advocacy groups. And then also just to reduce impose limits on how much is allowed to be given politicians, because a lot of this was about corruption. Okay, now let's move to substance use disorder. If we're going to do all those things we just said in order to deal with the generation of opioid crisis, or perhaps in the future addiction to other drugs, we still have to deal with the fact that we have many people who are already addicted to substances. And that does not just mean opioids. We've always had a long-term problem with alcohol, with tobacco. We've had problems with stimulant drugs and so on. What do we do about that population of people? So probably the most important thing to remember about this is about my country. I don't know the origins of addiction care in your country, but in my country, addiction care was not invented in the healthcare system. It was really something that was invented in the criminal justice system, and to some extent in the social welfare system, like charities who took care of the poor would do some work with addiction. And then there's also the mutual help community, groups like Narcotics Anonymous, of sort of people gathering together to try to help each other recover. All those systems may have done a great deal of good, but they aren't in the healthcare system. They're fundamentally outside of it. And in that way, addiction medicine in the United States is really different than, say, geriatrics or pediatrics that were invented by doctors and were already sort of in the house of medicine. So because of that history, addiction medicine has always been a bit outside, gotten less resources, been more stigmatized, and been poorly coordinated. And we think something critical is to bring it inside the American healthcare system. One of the reasons to do this is we have a lot of problems with quality of care. So this is a study of residential addiction treatment programs where people go to stay, and it's called a secret shopper study. And what that is somewhat people call up the programs and pretend that they're looking for care and ask for what is available. And what they found is that many treatment programs didn't offer decent services. Some of them actually forced people off medication that they needed, and that the accreditation of these programs was not rigorous enough to weed out really bad care. And this would be, I think, a lot harder to do if they were fully integrated into the American healthcare system, where we have a stronger regulatory norms. So what can we do about that? So we think that we need to move addiction care entirely within our existing health and social care systems permanently, like we do cancer, like we do heart disease. Currently, what's been done in response to the opioid crisis is to give grants to states, in other words, pots of money that last for 2 years or 3 years. And we would never do that for heart disease or cancer, because we know there's always going to be heart disease and cancer. But with addiction, it's our current policy is kind of framing it as a short-term problem. If we just work hard for 2 or 3 years, there won't be addiction anymore, and we won't need to pay attention to it. But that's not realistic. Addiction is an enduring feature of human health, unfortunately, so we have to permanently equip the healthcare system to deal with it. That means it needs to be funded the same as other types of care. It means doctors and nurses and psychologists and social workers all need to be trained to deal with it as they are with any other disease. This also means expanding insurance. We have a very complicated insurance system in the United States, not a system I would recommend anyone copying, but it's what we have. And we talk a lot in the commission about the need to expand that so that every person who has insurance for other conditions also has insurance to get substance use disorder care. And then also we want to curtail the provision of harmful treatments like some of those residential treatment programs that I mentioned. Now let's get into opioids' dual nature as a benefit and a risk to health. Because so many people are dying of opioids in the United States and Canada, there's gotten to be a sort of a drumbeat among politicians and some family groups to ban opioids or greatly restrict opioids or quite angry about opioids like fentanyl. And in the commission, we tried very hard to point out that there is nothing good or bad about opioids. Opioids are molecules in themselves. You can't say that they're good and you can't say that they're bad. It's all a question about how they are used. They can be beneficial, they can be risky. We must have them, we must use them wisely though. And just to show you this contrast, this is a quote from a book by Michael Stein, who is a physician. He's an internist, but he also writes very nice books. And it's about a patient he treated for a year, and he calls her Lucy, and she is so addicted to opioid pills that she's taking 30 or 40 per day. And she says to him, "I don't remember what normal looks like. What you feel every day, I feel only when I take my pills." Now, that's a statement of how miserable it is to be addicted to opioids. And that's one of the risks and has to be taken seriously. But here's something from a different patient. This is a patient that I took care of in hospice care. And this man said to me, "The most terrifying thing about my cancer is not my coming death. It's the memory of my grandfather in the hospital screaming for God to kill him because he was in so much pain." Now, it was very nice to be able to tell this man that there had been major improvements in pain medicine since the time his grandfather died, and that the hospice team included people who had spent their whole lives studying how to manage pain. And a big reason they were able to do that was because of developments in opioids. Fentanyl is killing tens of thousands of people in the United States every year, but it is also, when used properly, a wonderful medication, and absolutely including in hospice. When the fentanyl patch came out for people with, stage 4 cancers, bone cancers, and so on, it created a lot of relief. And so we just have to remember both, which of these things is true, is both is true. Opioids can destroy lives. Opioids can dramatically improve lives. So we have to have a policy framework that honors that reality, a balanced policy framework. And there you go. There's an image just to express that view. And we lose sight of that. Sometimes we lose sight of that within countries, and sometimes we lose sight of it around the world because policies around opioids are set, by the United Nations and by treaties. And we have to always remember there are countries that have way too many opioids, like mine, but there's also countries that don't have enough. And we have to have a policy internationally that tries to solve that problem and not pretend that we want to get rid of them or that we want an infinite amount of them. We have to have a balance. For the United States, what do we think we need? Well, we need a national pain strategy. You need to think through at the highest levels how to prevent pain, how to respond to pain. There's all kinds of pain, physical pain, injury, work-related injuries, how to treat it, and also, of course, a policy around opioids. The United States actually developed one at the end of the administration of President Obama, who I worked for, but it was dropped. It was released at the end, and the next administration decided to drop it. So we're calling on the current administration to revive the national pain strategy. Second, we point out that the current problems with opioids damage trust in the medical system. When you had corruption in medicine, when you had people giving, pharmaceutical representatives giving lectures at medical schools without admitting they were pharmaceutical company executives, when you had people taking payments and so on, when you had people prescribing in ways that hurt people, that damaged trust. And when you need trust to provide healthcare, trust is a very precious commodity in the clinical interaction. So we say that we have to restore trust in medicine, and the best way to do that is to have doctors themselves lead safer prescribing initiatives, not to resist them. We've certainly had doctors who have resisted. They've been angry at any oversight, resisting any monitoring at all. That just builds mistrust. We'd much rather have doctors lead this than anybody else. being the ones to say, okay, let's make sure we prescribe opioids when it's right, but we don't prescribe them when it's not going to help people. I mean, we still have in the United States something like 1 in 8 people who comes to emergency room for a twisted ankle leaving with an opioid. That should not be. We have something like 50,000 opioid prescriptions a year for people who have a completely uncomplicated tooth extraction. That should not be. So we have work we need to do, and we want doctors to be leading it. We also point out that opioids are very useful in the treatment of opioid use disorder, and that we probably need to expand access to that. And by opioid, and with that opioid agonist therapies, medications like methadone, medications like buprenorphine. We make the case in there that part of having a good, sensible policy about opioids means making them available to people who are addicted. The report also delves into an issue that is pretty important about should we approve opioids or any other drugs for that matter. Currently, we have a Food and Drug Administration that is responsible for that. It's a national government agency. And the way it judges whether a drug should be approved for doctors to prescribe is it looks at what happens if you assume only the patient prescribed the drug gets it and they take it exactly as directed. And what we learned in the opioid crisis is if you impose that standard, you underestimate the risks of opioids because, of course, first off, many people other than the patient take it if the prescription is sold or stolen or shared. And many people don't take it as directed because they get addicted to it and they run through a month's supply of pills in a week or even a day. And so we think these things need to be considered in how the FDA approves drugs. In other words, to think about not just the clinical view lens of the individual patient, but also to think about public health. What happens if the drug gets diverted? What happens if people take it to the point of addiction? And I'm pleased to say that this has become something the FDA is seriously considering. This is a viewpoint in the Journal of the American Medical Association, written by 2 former very high-ranking FDA officials recommending this approach. Okay, so now we're going to get to preventing opioid crises beyond North America. What happened about 20, 30 years ago with the tobacco industry is an important example to think about. So tobacco smoking used to be much more prevalent in Europe and the United States and Canada and Australia, and all those countries started restricting tobacco products. They restricted advertising, they raised taxes, and they raised the age at which you were allowed to smoke. And that was good for those countries. But those countries didn't do enough to stop those same companies, many of which were based in those countries, from simply going to other countries to promote smoking. And that's exactly what they did. Tobacco exploded in Africa, in Asia, in South America. The regulators just took care of their own populations and didn't act, in my opinion, as responsible global citizens. So we have significant worry about the same thing happening with opioids. In other words, the wealthier countries will regulate them tightly, but those companies will simply go to other nations and start the process all over again. And we see evidence of that. This is an article I'd recommend to you. It was published in a British newspaper, The Guardian. You can find it online. Search on that, the title on that slide. And by the way, you're welcome to my slides, but about the entry of some of the for-profit companies into India, and including over-promotion and promoting opioids for the wrong indications, and sort of being driven by the profit motive. Absolutely not unique to India. There's been same sort of issues in China, with including up to the point of sales representatives putting on a white coat and stethoscopes and pretending to be doctors in Chinese hospitals to promote specifically OxyContin sales. And yes, OxyContin is the same drug owned by the same family that did this in the United States. And even though that company has been shut down and that company's under restriction, they haven't been restricted from doing the same thing in other nations. All the things like fraudulent advertising, paying people off, a lot of really unethical conduct. They can do that in other countries and generate opioid crises other places. This is a quote from when the company that made OxyContin was sued. A lot of their internal correspondence and discussions came out, and one of the famous phrases was, "We're only just getting started." And this story was in the Los Angeles Times, a very good newspaper. You can see the authors there. But all the countries in red is where they were making at the time major pushes internationally to just rebuild their OxyContin market overseas, using the same tactics that are now illegal in the United States. And scandals have followed them. The Sackler family, which owns the patent to Purdue Pharma, also owns a company called Mundi Pharma, which makes OxyContin in the rest of the world. And Mundi's under no restrictions at all. And there's already been scandals with Mundi. Here's ones in Italy concerning bribing and trying to over-promote these drugs. And it's working. We picked a group of countries. These are developed countries. We showed this in the Lancet Commission report. We could have picked lots of other countries, but pretty sharp increases in opioids per capita being issued in lots of countries. Australia is one. It's had like a 15-fold increase, and with that have come increased opioid initiated hospitalizations, addictions, and overdose. Now, all that said, the opioid crisis is not just about oversupply, it's also about undersupply. I've been talking about places that have too many opioids, but we also have to remember, and I don't need to remind you of this, we have places that don't have enough. Excess is only one type of aspect of the opioid crisis. Another is access, places that don't have any access. This is a chart with how much MMEs per 1,000 inhabitants are available in different countries. And as you can see, North America, at least US and Canada, very, very high, too high. But a lot of other countries for which we have data, very low, and I would say frequently too low. As a result, and I don't need to tell you this, we have people, dying, for example, in excruciating pain. People being in pain all day long for years and years and years that is not being relieved because they can't get access to medication. So as a commission, again, on this principle of balance, we didn't want to say, oh, because there's so many opioids in the US and Canada, international agreement should restrict them everywhere. There's no reason why other countries should have to suffer for our mistakes. And instead that we need to have some way to provide opioids to countries that don't have enough. And how do you do that without just recreating the American opioid crisis? Well, we looked around and we saw there was another Lancet Commission on palliative care and pain relief. And they suggested generic morphine as a potential solution. Generic morphine is pretty cheap. It really would not be that expensive for donor nations to pay for it and have WHO distribute it in countries that don't have sufficient access to analgesia. And we endorse a version of that recommendation. We focus specifically on hospitals and hospices and low-income nations. They should get their generic morphine. And there's no reason why the oversupply of opioids in rich countries should stop this from happening. And so to find the balance, how we see this is that if you want to balance the benefits and the cost of opioids, you're more likely to do that when the profit motive is not dominant. In other words, if our approach to expanding access to opioids in countries that don't have enough is essentially just to let the companies that started the opioid crisis in North America do whatever they want, sell as much as they want, promote as much as they want, without regulation, that's just going to create a lot of suffering. We couldn't see a way to get out of that, again, as long as their profit motive is the driver. Because if what you're concerned about is profit, then you want as many people addicted to opioids as possible, because opioid addicted people are the best customers. They consume an enormous amount. So we look for a way to thread that needle, and it's to constrain the conduct of those companies around the world, at the same time providing for free generic morphine so that people can have pain relief, and governments are not forced into this terrible decision of either having their citizens be in unspeakable pain or making a deal with the devil, these companies that really in the end are just going to want money. And so that's how we tried to put those things together. And I'm happy to say, since our commission came out, we've been working closely with the Lancet Commission on palliative care and pain relief, as well as the Lancet Commission on the value of death, to try to realize this balance in global regulation of opioids. It's a very, very long report. Lancet Commission reports are really almost like small books. So I didn't go to every single detail of it, but I want you to know that we have a website, which is, the name is up there, opioids.stanford.edu. It has everything all available to the public. You can see any the report of the commission. You can see who was on the commission and their background and their connections to everything. You can see a highlighted version of our regulations. You can look at all the news coverage. There was enormous news coverage about this around the world. And also the model I mentioned, our predictive model of which policies would have the most impact, is available on there as well for anyone who wants it. It should be easy to access. If you have any trouble, just send me an email and I'll make sure you get what it is if you weren't able to get something directly from the site, but you should be able to get it all there. It's all in the public domain for anyone. All right, thank you. That concludes the slides, and I will exit out of the slide and we have a chance to talk and answer questions.
Thank you, Dr. Humphreys. So, as what I take from this presentation is there are two sides for opioid crisis. One is excess, like North America, where they have each or the morphine equivalent per capita consumption of opioid is very, very high. But if you look at it, India, it's on the other side. Maybe the people is, I think the per capita consumption is less than 0.5 milligram. So that's the comparison between the two countries. But even then, I think when we make policies on opioids, we should be very careful that the crisis which happened in North America should not happen in India. So there should
Very
be.
well said. Very, very well said. That is exactly our read too.
So I think we can open the forum for discussion. Nobody? No question? Okay.
Sir, US is a country which is so foremost in formulating regulations. But what I feel is that why is it that you cannot bring in legislation to control this crisis in your country?
Yeah, so that's a good question. We spent a lot of time on that looking at the different mechanisms by which regulators failed. And, a lot of this comes down to money. For example, if you're running for office, if you want to be a senator or a congressperson, there is no longer any limit in American law how much money a company can give you. And there's really nothing like money to short circuit the public imagination, give you to campaign, in other words, to run a campaign where you campaign for election. So that creates a lot of potential for corporate interests to get their way. Also, there's an entire industry of just lobbying. So there are more people who lobby for the interests of the pharmaceutical industry in Washington full time than there are members of the US Congress. So any bill, any effort to restrict, you just have, just a swarm of people coming in, invariably well-dressed, persuasive, smooth, good-looking people who come in and explain to you why it'd be very bad to do any kind of restriction for the industry. And so those kinds of things have always presented challenges in the United States to regulate industries, not just this industry. We've had terrible challenges with other industries as well. But it isn't just the US, because Canada, although I think they've done a better job than us, has also faced similar sorts of challenges. I mean, there's just an awful lot of money on the table. OxyContin made brought in revenues of over $35 billion to the Sackler family. So if you're making 35 billion in revenue, you're willing to spend an awful lot of money to make that business bigger and do anything you can to protect it.
It's more like greed, isn't it? So, but then again, why can't the legislators and the lawmakers make law against that, like lobbying? Why can't they restrict that?
I mean, think about it. What is the first thing that would happen if we actually did used to have a law that restricted how much money you could give. And then our Supreme Court overturned that law. But getting that law in was very, very hard because, of course, when you say, let's restrict campaign donations so that the average person, the little person who might want to give $20 has as much influence as a company that can give 20 million. Well, the second you do that, of course, everyone who can give 20 million runs in and says, no, don't do that. And applies pressure. So we did for a while have that, but that was taken away by our court. And we had no illusions as a commission that, this is going to change because we said so. We just felt the need to say it because it was true. And because we think that kind of institutionalized corruption of the American political process is part of why we have this problem.
And another thing is that why can't you legalize the lesser addictive drugs like marijuana and things like that, so that people can have access to it instead of criminalizing them?
Oh, we have legalized cannabis. I mean, most Americans have legal access to cannabis, and cannabis use has gone up dramatically. And by the way, opioid use and overdoses have gone up as cannabis has gone up. So this was pitched as a solution. Once people get access to cannabis, its pain relieving properties will drive down opioid overdose. The opposite happened. Opioid overdoses have gone up as cannabis use has gone up. So that has not worked, unless, of course, you're running a cannabis company, in which case it's worked very well because you've made a lot of money.
But what is the reason, sir? I mean, it should have reduced the use of opioids and stronger opioids, isn't it?
Well, people get addicted. I mean, cannabis is, again, poor regulation in the United States. Cannabis is way stronger here than probably anywhere else. So, historically in illegal markets, cannabis in the United States might have had a THC content of 5, 6, 7%. Now the average product is 20%, and some of these products are 50, 60, 70, 80, 90%. So when people are using those, it's no longer about pain relief, it's about you get addicted to them. So then you're addicted to, and for all addictions, it doesn't really matter. When you get addicted to one thing, your risk for getting addicted to other things goes up. If you're addicted to alcohol, you're more likely to try other drugs. If you're addicted to heroin, you're more likely to try stimulants and so on, for all kinds of reasons. It really has not worked. I definitely think more broader than cannabis, and we do talk about this in the report, we need more pain relieving medications that don't have addictive liability. And we write a bit about, there's some exciting neuroscience about people have, in animals, for example, been able to separate the effects of the opioids in the brain. So make an opioid that binds in such a way that it gives pain relief, but it doesn't slow breathing, for example. Or an alternative would be just pain relieving medications that don't rely on the opioid system at all in the brain. It'd be, and that could be a cannabinoid based, or it could be something else. But there are hundreds of medications that have some potential to relieve pain, and getting people to use those and doctors to be trained in them would be another way to kind of engage in this balance. We're trying to reduce pain, but we're trying not to get people addicted to opioids.
If Dr. Priya is asking, though India is on the other side of the spectrum, how to prevent such a crisis in India? Do you know anything about Indian situation?
Is that in the chat?
Yeah.
See if I can see it. Okay. Oh, how can we prevent such a crisis there? So, first off, that some of these companies really are pretty malign. They will not. I would not regard them as friends when they arrive there and say all we want to do is help with your pain. I would look up the history of those companies and see what they've done in other countries, and not just implicitly trust that they're there for the purpose of social welfare. They're there for the purposes of making money. Second, it depends on the basic strengths of your regulatory system. So things like making sure that whoever's involved in approving medications does not in any way have any financial interest in approving medications, that education of doctors is not corrupted by industry. We had cases in the United States where industry representatives were teaching medical students about their products without even disclosing to the students that they were an industry representative. They were just presented as like, well, this is a member of our faculty. So all those kinds of things. And then second, I think we all need to work where we can internationally with like the UN ODC and the United Nations and the INCB to provide safe opioids to India. Whatever that is, morphine, generic morphine, or so on. That we need opioids. You need opioids. You know that. You're taking a palliative medicine class, but we need to have treaty structures because these decisions are made, through the UN that lets you have access to opioids not via just profit-seeking companies, but a way that you can get them without the potential corruption that comes from companies like Mundi Pharma. That is something that you don't have the power to do, and I don't have the power to do by ourselves. But if all of us work together, we have a better chance of doing it. And that's one of the things we've been doing with the Lancet commissions is, working closely with the UN to try to get a critical mass of people to recognize the importance of this problem. It's a big political challenge, but that no one of us can solve, but we all have to be engaged in because patients need these medications, as you all know.
I think another mechanism in India is that the institutions who can stock and dispense opioids are recognized by the state drug controllers, and each and every institution will not be able to stock the opioids. So only the recognized medical institutions can stock and dispense opioids. And there will be an experienced doctor in pain and who has experience in prescribing opioids. I think, the teaching in most of the physicians who prescribe opioids, especially strong opioids, they have experience from palliative care centers. And the classical or traditional teaching in palliative care is that opioids, it should be used cautiously. And we also have the responsibility not only to prescribe it for the needed patient, person, but also to see that it is used judiciously. So I also understand that in US, even for some maybe tooth extraction, doctors write oxycodone for 2 weeks because it is under insurance coverage, something like that. I don't know whether I'm sure whether I'm true about it, but those things which we don't do here. These are few things which I think is something protective.
Yeah, I appreciate hearing that. You're one of the things you're raising is who prescribes and are they trained and do they have a good understanding of the risks and benefits of opioids? And if you have palliative care doctors, I think they know. And so I didn't, and we didn't have any problem in the United States from palliative care doctors over prescribing. The change, and the companies really pushed this, was pushing primary care doctors with almost no training in pain management and no training in addiction to start becoming the frontline prescribers for opioids for all kinds of, aches and pains. And that is what, really kicked this off. So if you are able to make it in your country such that the people doing the prescribing are very well trained and know what they're doing, that's terrific. You're much less likely to get into trouble than when you have somebody who, really just doesn't have much background in how to use them safely. And I have to say, we have at least made some progress in the US and in Canada, both in providing more training. I mean, every doctor should know, right? If you're prescribed, not just for opioids, but for any addictive drug, potentially addictive drug that you prescribe. But we have a long way to go. I mean, you can go through medical education in the US and Canada, still getting very little exposure to issues of either pain management or addiction.
And there are three more questions in the chat. And Dr. Punita is asking what route was fentanyl overuse common, IV or other?
Okay, so first off, the fentanyl markets in the United States are not based on diversion. So this is different than where the OxyContin, which a huge amount of the pills were actually had been legitimately prescribed. Our fentanyl supply is like 99% produced illegally. So it's not like people stealing fentanyl patches from hospice patients. It's being now produced entirely by criminals, essentially. The most common route of use, there certainly is IV use, but at least like what I see the most now is smoking. So heating it up, typically people having it in a pill, sometimes in a powder, putting it on a piece of foil, heating it, and inhaling it, or melting it and injecting it. That's mostly what happens. It's coming in pill form. And the cartels that make it have access to professional pill producing machines, just like the pharmaceutical companies have. So their pills look exactly like regular pharmaceuticals, but of course that's not what they are. Let me see now. I'm just looking at these other questions. Opioid use disorder, in what groups is it most prevalent? What age groups? So we do see damage across the age spectrum. So we just published a paper among people who were 65 years old or older, that since this all started, they've had a 400% increase in opioid overdose. So there's no group that is untouched by this. Our elderly have also had higher rates of death. But most of the people with opioid use disorder are, and most of the people dying are in middle age. So to be people in their 30s and 40s and 50s is where we see most of the deaths. Initiation, when people first start using all drugs that they get addicted to in the United States, is almost always in teenage years and in the people in their 20s. That's initiation, not necessarily they get addicted, but where they start. And that probably has a lot to do with brain development. Our brains are much more plastic, much more changeable when we're young, just as it's easier to learn another language when you're young than it is when you're my age. It's also much easier to acquire an addiction. And then, do you have generic morphine in India? I don't know. Do you have generic morphine in India? You tell me. I don't know.
I think we do not have generic morphine in India, but morphine is very cheap. That's also a fact compared to fentanyl or buprenorphine. Morphine is very, very cheap. But the pharma companies are pushing for fentanyl patch as well as for buprenorphine transdermal patch. So we have to also understand the behind that, because as Keith told, pharma companies have vested interest to promote their product, and when we use the patch, fentanyl patch or buprenorphine patch, we should have justification also why we use it. So. Anything else?
Hello, sir.
Hi.
Sir, Doctor, sir, whenever you publish this through Lancet Commission, committing about against the big pharmaceuticals, the statements about big pharmaceuticals against them. So, do you face any challenges whenever you do this advocacy works? And if so, what kind of threats or kind of challenges you face by doing this advocacy? Yes.
Yeah. Well, they haven't killed me yet. They've probably thought about it. The main, the way you fight in the U.S. system would be, when somebody like me, say, went up to a state legislature, and I say, okay, we need to have some restrictions on prescribing opioids, would be they would have other witnesses in the same hearing who work for them, who are very persuasive and so on. And they might make donations to people who are on the committee hearing the legislation to their campaigns. And they have people, lobbyists, who come in and say, oh, you could change this part of the law this way and that way and so on. So they have that very strong, it's the influence industry, and they're very good at it. And that's partly how they were accomplish that. So we face that kind of resistance. Sometimes also there's people who are just are suffering, who get angry about this discussion, and I sympathize with them completely. Maybe they were a pain patient, and their doctor stopped prescribing their medication because they learned about addiction, and so they may get mad at someone like me and say, you should never talk about addiction, because if you do, then someone will take away the medication. And I understand their suffering, that they get mad about it, but I also know that we have to be honest with people about the risk of addiction. If we don't do that, then we get a lot of trouble. So sometimes I have some of that. Period. And we also have big suits going on, lawsuits in our courts. So the industries have been sued successfully, actually, by a number of states where many people died. And that is a very intense battle too. I decided personally to not do legal work, but some of my colleagues do, and then you're in a courtroom. So you're against very, again, powerful, well-paid lawyers and expert witnesses who will come after you in all kinds of ways, as they're allowed to, in American courtroom, to fight them there. But again, there's so much money on the other side, billions and billions and billions of dollars. It's a lot of resources to protect their business.
Thank you, sir. And in that case, also you also should need some funding to to fight them against.
Yeah, I mean, I'm lucky. I have a job at a university, so I can do this. But there are people who are parents who buried a child, and they for them to even go to their city council, and they have jobs, they don't have any, they don't have professional lobbyists. They're just people, that's why they often get steamrolled, is there's no one really to advocate for them for that. So that's definitely a real issue, that this is not a novel insight. Rich people have more political power than poor people, and we see that all over, and we certainly see that around this particular issue. Here's a question. This is a good one. Did some U.S. doctors show a knee-jerk reaction and stop prescribing opioids? We definitely had some knee-jerk reactions. So this is the same, sort of the opposite problem of people saying opioids, 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 opioids for everyone, is then once deaths started to mound up, people saying, oh no, what I mean is opioids, opioids, opioids for no one. Opioids are bad now. And some doctors then would taper patients who had been on opioids for a very long time, very suddenly. And those patients very often did very badly, to the point of doing things like taking their own life, or going out into the street to buy fentanyl, which is of course very, very dangerous. And it's that same thing of losing a sense of balance, thinking that opioids, it's just like a big switch, like on a railroad crossing. We have to be this way or that way. We have to give opioids for, a stubbed toe, or we won't even give opioids for bone cancer. And it just should not be that way. It's a dial. It's not a switch that goes 0 or 100. there's a sweet spot where we give people access and we give them the care they need, and we don't overdo it. And that's what we need to look for. And to have medicine jerking back and forth is really bad. One of the members of our commission, Dr. Erin Krebs, I would say, and I thought this was very moving, she said, I feel like we hurt our patients twice. We hurt them the first time by putting on opioids when they shouldn't have been on. And then we hurt them a second time by pulling them off when we shouldn't have. And so that's a real risk, because it's fundamentally, here's something like when I talk to like a medical residents in training, and like some of them will say, someone just retired and I inherited his or her patients. So now I have all these patients, and I've got a patient who's on, 600 MME a day and has been on it for 10 years, and they never should have been put on that dose. And so should I take them off that dose? And what I say is that maybe you're right. They never should have been put on that dose, but you don't get to go back in time and make that initial decision. You have to deal with the person the way they are. And the way they are when they started, zero MME might not have been a big deal, but now it would be an enormous deal. It would affect them. They've adapted, they're, adjusted to these opioids, they're dependent on them, they're functioning, however they're functioning in context of them. And so it doesn't really matter whether that should have been done 10 years ago. It's just, what can you do right now? And, it may be the place where you create a safer opioid environment is not by rapidly tapering that person off, but instead by the new patient you see today who doesn't need opioids, not starting them on that so that 10 years they're not in that person's situation. And that can be unsatisfying to people because, they want to maybe undo the past and all that, but we don't get that choice as human beings to undo the past. We have to take people where they are. And it's when you're on, and you all know this, we know if you're on very high doses of opioids and you've been on them for a very long time, it's hard to get off them safely. And if you're going to do it, it has to be done very, very carefully and slowly over a long period of time. And sometimes that does work. But sometimes, it's just the best thing is to leave the person where on the dose that they're on.
Yeah, there is again one question in the chat. Which all groups of doctors should get trained in opioid use?
Yeah. So that's a really good question. And we talked about that in the commission. So we had for a while this very strange thing, in our opinion, which was the US would license doctors to prescribe buprenorphine which is marketed usually as the name Suboxone, to provide it for people for opioid addiction, but only if they had specialist training in addiction. You had to go through like 8 hours of training. But on the other hand, if you want to prescribe OxyContin, you didn't need any special training at all. And so that's very strange. Why make it super easy to prescribe OxyContin and super hard to prescribe buprenorphine? So we said we should get rid of that rule, and instead all doctors should know something about addiction. And I'm glad that we've now changed, the government has now changed the system that way. So there's no more of this specialty requirement. Everybody, the way it works in our country is you get your license to practice medicine from your state you live in, but then you apply to the federal government to say, and I want to prescribe controlled substances. And you have to renew that license every 5 years, I think it is. So that at that point now, the government is going to require every doctor who prescribes controlled medication to go through some training about addiction. And I think this is really important, even if you're never interested in treating addicted patients, just so you understand when you prescribe a benzodiazepine or esketamine or an opioid, you could generate a problem in your patients, and you need to appreciate that risk. And also you need to be able to detect that in your patients and know what to do when it happens. And I think if we had that at the beginning, we might not have gotten into the situation where we had a huge number of people prescribing who frankly didn't really know really what they were doing. They were doing the best they could, but they didn't really know what they were doing. So I think this system is going to be much better. I just think anyone who prescribes a medication that can cause addiction should know something about addiction.
So Keith, in India, any doctors can prescribe strong opioids, any opioids. But the problem is that they cannot get it from the pharmacies. And because usually pharmacists do not stock morphine or fentanyl or things like that. Only recognized medical institutions will stock morphine or the other strong opioids. So even though but mostly all the doctors are afraid to prescribe opioids because of two problems. One is they think it will cause respiratory depression, and the other thing is that it will cause addiction. So mostly 95% of doctors are afraid to prescribe opioids. Uh, and even if they prescribe, uh, the patients will not get it unless they reach a recognized medical institution.
That's pretty restrictive.
Okay. I think, Keith, can you answer this? Any
Sure.
addiction?
Yeah. So one of the things, so I'm deputy editor-in-chief on a journal called Addiction. And one of the things that's been exciting, it's a global journal, is seeing more papers from India. That there's a growing cadre of people in India studying addiction. And in the US and in a lot of countries, addiction people and pain people sort of react, kind of treat each other as, I don't know, like rival armies or something. They don't go to each other's events. And I think it would be great to break that habit, so to have, there are conferences in India with top people really, really doing very good work, I think. But attend those and meet your colleagues who are experts in addiction, and invite them to your pain conferences and your pain meetings and programs like this, so they understand the other side, because sometimes they don't. Sometimes all they're taught about is the negative side of drugs, but that they should understand also that these drugs can be magnificent in the care of patients. I think if you can do that, you will be ahead of where a lot of the world is. My children are going to wake up in 3 minutes, so I have to be a father. So I'm going to have to go. But it was very nice to see all of you, and I hope someday we get to meet in person.
So thank you, Keith, for having you with us today and giving us the message of balancing during prescription of opioids. Thank you very much, and thank you everybody for attending today's session and making it interactive. Shreya, it's over to you.
Be well.
Okay, thank you so much for joining us, and we hope that your health is completely fine now. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you participants for making this session also interactive as usual. So without much delay, this is Sripriya along with Dr. Keith and Dr. Sunil Kumar signing off from the Pallium India's presentation desk. See you in the next session. Till then, everyone take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.